Now, the U.S. is now often the largest producer of oil and gas. And I think like even 20 years ago, I don't really think anyone would have predicted that. Like what is happening here? What's going on with this kind of shale revolution? And how does that like trend going forward?
It's the word revolution is warranted. I mean, it's a really remarkable thing that happened in the United States over the last 15, 20 years. So as you said, not many would have predicted it. When I arrived in Washington to serve in the Obama White House, 2009, I think Washington was just starting to realize something was happening with natural gas production. You should remember, if you go back a few years before that, 2004, 5, 6, there were 10, 20, 30 projects being permitted for people who wanted to spend billions of dollars building projects to import liquefied natural gas from the rest of the world, countries like Qatar.
And there was all these people talking about peak oil back then, too. That was very common.
You know, since oil was discovered in 1859 on my birthday in Titusville, Pennsylvania, roughly every 30 years, the world has worried that it's running out of oil. And then some new innovation, some new technology comes along where we're able to extract it from places we didn't think possible or ways we didn't think possible. We've known that there's oil trapped in shale rock for a long time. The question was, could it be extracted economically? And a few people saw that possibility. So, you said not many saw that 20 years ago. Well, there was a man named George Mitchell, who's kind of the father, so known as the father of fracking. And he spent the 1980s and 1990s experimenting and perfecting the technique, ridiculed by many of his peers, right? It's notable it was not the Exxon and the Chevron and companies like that. It was the small innovators like him who figured out how to do this, sold his company in, I think, around 2000 or so for a few $1 billion to Devon Energy, which realized he had figured out how to do something. It started with natural gas, which is more permeable. And we thought we suddenly had a huge amount of natural gas in this country, more than we could imagine. And then that technology was applied to oil production as well. And the numbers are really striking, as you said. If you go back, U.S. oil import, around 2005, 6, 7, the U.S. imported around 60% of its oil use. Today, the U.S. is a net exporter. So this is sort of a stunning turnaround. And the U.S. is now the largest oil producer in the world, larger than Russia, larger than Saudi Arabia.
Why is shale exploration not really a big deal in most other countries? Like, why is the U.S. such a special place?
There's a couple of reasons for it. I mean, we know that there's shale, the resource of shale oil exists in other places.
Yeah, apparently it's very plentiful in Europe, right?
There's some parts of Europe. I think the biggest places would probably be Argentina. Okay. Some parts of Latin America. There's a shale formation there known as the dead cow, Vaca Muerta, that has been talked about for a long time. Russia, China. There are parts of Europe that have shale, like gas in the Netherlands, and they were producing, trying to produce some of that. The UK has some, but there's a lot of resistance for environmental and other reasons, community opposition to developing it there. One thing that's important to note about the United States is the incentive to make this work, because of the landowner owns the resource in the United States. In most other parts of the world, the government owns the resource.
Owns what's the landowner might own the land, but the government owns what's underneath the land in most countries.
Yeah. So the incentive in the U.S. to lease mineral rights is something that you don't always find in other countries.
But you could imagine in China, they could change that tomorrow to incent people to drill, to explore shale, right? And for China, you can imagine they're a massive net importer today. It would be in their best interest to make shale happen.
For sure. They face other challenges, right? China, as you said, if China makes a top-down decision in the government, they can make things happen pretty quickly, as we've seen with solar, electric cars, other forms of technology. They have some of the largest shale gas reserves, actually. They lack the infrastructure to deliver that to market. So that requires a huge build out and pipelines and everything else. Water is a really key component for shale extraction. A lot of the shale resources abroad are populated in places where water is at a premium, and that can be an issue in China. Expertise. I mean, we did make this work in the US because of experimentation and a
Yep.
lot of small companies kind of competing with one another, and a lot failed, but some made it. You don't have that in parts of the world where there's like one big state-owned company that often isn't necessarily as entrepreneurial, as risk-taking, where the downside of failing is potentially high. And so that is part of the reason why the kind of entrepreneurial private sector spirit in the US, I think, made this happen. We talk all the time about the oil companies, so the oil industry, especially in the climate world too. We should remember the companies that come to people's mind: Exxon, Chevron, BP, the so-called super majors. There are, I think, 7 of them, or what was known as the Seven Sisters. They're 15% of the world's oil and gas supply. More than half the world's oil and gas supply are nationally owned companies, right? Companies owned by the state, like Saudi Aramco and others. And some of those are very good and very, very technically sophisticated, but many are not. And so it can be harder because to make shale work in many parts of the world that we're talking about, you would need to work in partnership, I think, with some of the big global majors that really have great expertise and technology, and the service companies as well.
But it seemed, it's not for some reason, I still don't get it. Like, I still don't get, like, it's now been like almost 20 years since like people started to really understand the shale revolution. A lot, most countries, especially countries like China, are very good at like, taking a technology that may have been developed in the US and scaling it up. They've done that so many times in the past. This is so core to so many countries, like security needs. It's core to their industrial needs. It's core to their economic needs. It's core even to their national pride needs. Like, why aren't more people investing in this around the world?
Well, you also need the economics to work, right? I mean, in Saudi Arabia, you can, in many parts of the country, extract oil for $5,
of course. I understand why it's not happening in Saudi Arabia. Yeah.
Well, no, I'm just saying. So we're in a market. We're in an oil market now that is relatively well supplied, and so I think people look at the outlook, and at some point these things go in cycles.
Yeah.
When people say, well, where, so we just had a massive discovery in Guyana. Guyana is going to become one of the largest oil producers in the world, and that was 10 years in the making, and now it'll have oil production for probably decades to come. I think when you look forward,
unless Venezuela messes it up or something.
well, that's right. So there's geopolitics in all of these things. There's more uncertainty today about the outlook for oil. I think that is one thing genuinely different. If you go back decades in the past, commodity traders obviously made money because there's unknown fluctuations in price. But if you said to someone, in the long run, where's oil demand going? Everyone knew it was going up, not down. Today, that's actually in question.
Oh, got it. So because 10 years from now, there may be less oil demand than there is today. In fact, that actually could be a likely the thing that could happen.
It's certainly possible. There's a lot of talk about peak demand. Some people think it'll happen in the next couple of years. Some people think it'll be in 2035 or something. There's uncertainty about exactly when, but the probability that oil demand is just going to march up at 1% to 2% a year after year after year, that I think there's much more skepticism.
Okay, especially this is like
about.
At least a decade project to invest in to start getting returns coming out of.
Yeah, although it's interesting in the US, and part of the reason I think you saw Exxon buy Pioneer for $60 billion, a big shale producer. Shale is so-called short cycle, right? And that means U.S. went from producing 5 million barrels a day to 13 million barrels a day. To do that, you need to continually frack new wells because the decline rate is very fast. You frack a new well, you get a certain amount of oil from it, but the extent to which the oil coming out of that well diminishes is much faster for shale than it is for something like a conventional project or an offshore project. There's something desirable about that if you're uncertain about future oil demand. You might not want to invest tens of billions of dollars in a new offshore project that's going to take 20 years to pay back.
Yep.
You want to invest in things where you can shut it down or ramp it up quickly because we're in a world of new uncertainty.
Yeah,
so I just think when people look
in some
at where
ways
the
also
market
like
is,
that would stabilize prices. So like prices would never get too low, never get too high if you could like ratchet up and down shale.
that was the idea when shale first started. I remember an op-ed by Alan Greenspan in the Financial Times sort of arguing that. And I think that's become a bit less true over time as there's been more consolidation. When you take these massive global companies like Exxon with large balance sheets, they have a certain production plan. They're going to probably stick with it through cycles. But, we did see that in the pandemic, for example, right? The U.S. production went from 5 to 13 million barrels a day. and then it collapsed from 13 to 10 because for a short period of time the world just didn't want oil because we shut down the global economy to deal with the pandemic. And you saw very quickly in the United States in particular, companies, idle workers, idle rigs, just say we're going to stop, and then production actually fell really fast in a way
Yeah.
that would not be the case in many other parts of the world.